Hello and welcome to episode 13 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'll be discussing the thoughts of the American musician and composer Frank Zappa in relation to media manipulation, free speech, censorship, and democracy. Zappa was a different type of musician within the music industry, in that he was also a media and cultural critic, often directing his criticism towards popular culture, which he felt was conforming to societal norms. And he was scathing towards those in power, who sought to censor artistic freedom, free speech, and democracy. He was critical of US television and radio, arguing that the former was a medium of media manipulation and that the latter played safe and challenging music. He certainly held libertarian beliefs such as free speech, a belief in a small state, with limited powers of intervention into people's lives, which in turn would guarantee individual rights. But he also held views contrary to libertarian philosophy such as taxation, which libertarians consider as theft. He sung about taxing the churches and railed against large business corporations who avoided paying tax, or in his words, not paying their fair share. As a composer, he was a disruptor, which is why his greatest influence in classical music, if we can call it that, was Edgar Varèse. Full name Edgar Victor Achille Charles Varèse. And once you put these two things together, i.e. Zappa's cultural critique and the musical influence of Varèse, then we can begin to understand that Zappa was indeed unique. We can't understand Zappa without listening to Varèse because therein lies the bedrock of Zappa's philosophy concerning musical expression. For instance, and this is crucial, in my opinion, Varèse gave Frank the means to create his musical version of critical theory. Zappa used the inspiration that Varèse provided as a means to set us free from state and media propaganda and to think critically and independently for ourselves. This latter part has echoes of Kant's comments on the 18th century Enlightenment, which was meant to set us free from external influences and begin to think independently from powerful institutions. In episode 5, I discussed Adorno's and Horkheimer's criticism of the Enlightenment ideals, arguing that it had failed in its objectives. And Kant was also fully aware of the limitations of the actual Enlightenment that had occurred during the 18th century. Indeed, Kant made a distinction by the actual Enlightenment and Enlightenment as theory. Enlightenment in theory means breaking away from the restraints required for independent thinking. And for Kant, it meant relying less on the church, aristocracy, and the state for knowledge. Or in Zappa's case, relying less on the media, who in his time had replaced the other powers as the most powerful source of information. Thus, what Zappa was attempting, knowingly or otherwise, was to resurrect the failures of the actual 18th century Enlightenment. Listening to Varèse and some of Zappa's music can be hard, even excruciating, but perhaps that's the point. They do it to wake us up from our slumber of apathy, as Frank Zappa said. Listening to it and be startled, be offended even, because it challenges the status quo. I'm not an authority on Zappa, but who is? But I am a fan, and I have been for a very long time. Besides being a musician, composer, media and cultural critic, Zappa was also a humorist, a satirist, and a social and political commentator. However, it's important to say that he always argued that his lyrics were more sociological rather than political. I think in many ways Zappa was also a social flaneur, who was constantly observing, reflecting and commenting on the world around him, which can constantly be heard in his music. His criticisms of American television are related to his statements about thinking independently and engaging critically with television material. On his album Kill Ugly Radio, released in 1995, Zappa let rip about what he felt about American TV on the track titled Slime. And here's how it goes. I am gross and perverted. I'm obsessed and deranged. I have existed for years, but very little has changed. I'm the tool of the government and industry too, for I am destined to rule and regulate you. I may be vile and pernicious, but you can't look away. I make you think I'm delicious with the stuff that I say. I'm the best you can get. Have you guessed me yet? I'm the slime oozing out from your TV set. You will obey me while I lead you and eat the garbage that I feed you until the day that we don't need you. Don't go for help. No one will heed you. Your mind is totally controlled. It has been stuffed into my mold, and you will do as you are told until the rights to you are sold. Now, the psychoanalyst Edgar Varèse, he who used propaganda tools through advertising, would have been fairly impressed by Slime. The lyrics from Slime clearly demonstrate Zappa's belief of the power of the US media was having in shaping human thinking. But he also despised both the public apathy that had generally set firm within the United States and violent protest, which for him achieved nothing. Thus he occupies a space not dissimilar to that of the Frankfurt School, who advocated critical theory as a way to contest dominant ideologies and begin to think about alternative ways of living. Like the Frankfurt School, Zappa placed emphasis on the individual and their ability to think freely and independently. In my view, there is also a strong connection between Zappa and the philosopher Hannah Arendt with respect to thinking freely and independently. Whereas Arendt's focus was mainly on how totalitarian systems like Nazism and Stalinism create an environment for the incapacity to think for oneself, Zappa, like the Frankfurt School, recognized that this environment existed in American capitalist consumer culture, particularly concerning the mass production and the commercialization of culture. We can see echoes here of the culture industry, which the Frankfurt School argued was the negation of the individual, and in Zappa's case, the negation of artistic expression. In 2018, Riot Material produced a piece on Zappa written by Molly McGilbert titled Why Frank Zappa is the Voice America Still Needs, which features this quote from Zappa. The evils that affect American society, many of them were produced by TV. All the poor information, the attitudes, and the false values were brought to them through the television set. But Zappa, like Arendt, made it clear that it wasn't just the TV or radio that was to blame, but also people who were reluctant to think differently. This is clearly the message on the track titled Who Are the Brain Police, which features on the 1966 album Freak Out. Zappa made it abundantly clear that most people refuse to even consider alternatives to what already exists. For instance, in a 1988 interview he gave to Bob Marshall, he tells the interviewer that the reluctance by individuals to consider alternatives was a form of self-mutilation, and went as far as saying, "So, you don't even need to blame it on a central brain police agency. You've got plenty of people who willingly subject themselves to this self-mutilation." Like Marx, he knew that big business prioritized exchange value over use value of commodities. Marx eloquently argued that commodities, products that had a use value, were socially useful to the community, whereas exchange value simply represented the economic cost, profit gained from production. The example the Frankfurt School gave was that, under capitalism, the price of the opera ticket becomes more valuable than the opera itself. On the live album Bongo Fury, Zappa warns his audience that advertisers want to sell them products that they don't really need in order to celebrate 200 years of American independence, warning them they're going to sell you things you don't really need. And this is what Marx called commodity fetishism. Zappa was warning his audience that the products advertised to them to celebrate the 200th anniversary of American independence had no use value whatsoever, and only had exchange value. In other words, profit for toy makers, of which shareholders would benefit from. Critical thinking was central to Zappa's beliefs, which was apparent in his public statements and music. One clear example of media workers creating mush that Zappa particularly disliked was so-called rock journalists. Now, I find this interesting because music journalism per se has escaped the wrath of media criticism, and in general it is an insipid, ingratiating and sycophantic form of writing. To be honest, it doesn't really deserve to be called journalism, with its complete lack of investigative interest. Zappa hated the way rock music writers created a figure that bore no resemblance to him. In other words, there was a gulf between representation and reality, which, using Umberto Eco's term, often turns into hyperreality, which in turn becomes our reality, even though it's fake, misleading, and manufactured. There is no doubt that Frank's criticism of the way rock music writers wrote about him was 100% correct. For the most part, they had no access to him, so they created a fictional character based on his appearance and his so-called eccentricity. This is what Frank called the freak, and if you look at the early images of Frank, you'll see this figure with long black hair, goatee beard, wearing strange hats at times, who just happened to play unusual music. And the way both rock music writers and the US mainstream media dealt with this was to present him not as an incredibly creative musician and composer, but rather as an oddball. I'm not even sure whether the term radical was used to describe him and his music, but for me it's a no-brainer. But rather than fight against the media image, Zappa embraced it and owned it and used it for his own purposes. Now, there's a long history of mocking someone as an outsider, which is designed to give the impression that such outsiders are both dangerous but also not to be taken seriously. Leon Trotsky was certainly one, and Jeremy Corbyn, the former socialist leader of the British Labour Party, is another. But unlike Trotsky or Corbyn, Zappa belonged to no party or organisation, which would have made him more of a target if he had been. But if there is a comparison to make, it is that Zappa was, like Trotsky and Corbyn, an intellectual, and intellectuals can scare people in positions of power. When Zappa sung that the media is a tool of the government and industry too, from Slime, it's a clear reference to media power and influence over thinking freely and independently. Zappa was a strong advocate for free speech, but it was based on the ability of people to think critically and independently. One particular grouping that Zappa had in his sights for denying free speech in music was the Parents Music Resource Centre, or PMRC. It was more commonly referred to as the Washington Wives. And he viewed them in the same way as he viewed the mainstream media as instruments of control over the minds of people. The PMRC were a censorship group who attempted to impose their conservative view of American family values by censoring music they disagreed with. Zappa often referred to the PMRC as fundamentalists. And in a 1988 interview he gave with Jesse Nash from the Beat magazine, he gave this response to a question on whether, do you think Americans are becoming more conservative than in the past? And this is what Zappa answered. No. The people who believe that the issue of rock lyrics is more important than problems with our nation's poverty or with the deficit is in the minority. The PMRC received over 10,000 letters before the hearings and thought that was a lot. I happen to feel that 10,000 letters is a minimal response. But Ann Landers ran a letter in her column by a woman demanding warning labels on rock albums that received a response of over 20,000 letters, with the response 90-1 against labelling. Zappa continued, the censorship movement is an orchestrated piece of business not just about rock and roll lyrics. In San Antonio, an ordinance was created stating that the age of 13 was the minimum age for a healthful person to see a rock concert. A former psychiatrist for the US Air Force made a study and determination. The city council and mayor agreed. This ordinance is a way to circumvent the First Amendment. There is a distinct possibility that, because of the ruling in San Antonio, that other small-minded communities might follow suit. They might use this ordinance as a model. Now, Zappa notoriously defended the First Amendment that guarantees free speech, and in 1985 he gave testimony to the Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee in Congress on that issue. He spoke against the parents' advisory stickers that the PMRC were advocating to place on records to warn of the content, and he was so incensed by their campaign he produced an album titled Congress Shall Make No Law, which was released in 2010 by the Zappa Family Trust on Zappa Records. It's presented in the form of the Ten Commandments, and I highly recommend listening to it. On the track titled Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house, nor his farm, nor his cattle, nor anything that is his, which is the 10th commandment, Zappa takes aim at the FCC, otherwise known as the Federal Communications Commission. On it, Zappa is both angry and critical of how the FCC had been turned into an organ of censorship and oppression that was restricting artistic freedom. Zappa explains that the FCC charter clearly demonstrates that it is not supposed to be used as a censorship body. Zappa also believed that democracy doesn't work without the full participation of people, and so he encouraged voter registration. His wife, Gail, made a video humorously titled Keep the Government Out of Your Underpants, where Gail Zappa promotes voter registration through wakethebeast.org/vote. I suppose one of the remarkable things about Zappa was his popularity in parts of Central and Eastern Europe during and after the Cold War. He was revered in the former Czechoslovakia, where his music was smuggled into the country and bootlegged for consumption. There's no doubt that his music and his message contributed towards the Velvet Revolution that ended Stalinism in Czechoslovakia. His messaging on freedom and democracy, his comments against censorship in music, and his anti-authoritarian stance resonated in Czechoslovakia and beyond. Zappa performed in the former Czechoslovakia and was a guest of the leader Václav Havel after the collapse of Stalinism in 1989. His music inspired dissent in Czechoslovakia and beyond in the countries aligned to Russia. His music set out to promote individual thinking, free from the state, whether in the former USSR or the United States of America, or wherever it may exist. Zappa's criticism of media and corporate control was applicable in both the US and the former Soviet systems under state control. The only difference was that in the USA, control was filed under corporate and commercial interests, but in the Stalinist states it was filed under political interests. In Vilnius, Lithuania, A bust of Zappa was erected after the collapse of Stalinism in 1991. Such was his influence and his anti-authoritarian stance, even though he never played a gig there. But his music was smuggled in, and like the good people of Czechoslovakia, Lithuanians listened in small groups and away from the prying eyes of informers and police. The bust of Zappa had replaced the bust of Lenin, the leader of the October 1917 revolution in Russia. Now that is something else. The Lithuanian-based Frank Zappa fan club, who erected the bust in Vilnius, even made another and sent it to Baltimore, where he was born. In 1994, the British Marxist Ben Watson penned a piece for The Wire titled Hail and Farewell. Watson was a member of the Trotskyist British Socialist Workers' Party who published his book titled The Negative Dialectics of Poodle Play in 1994. Watson had taken his lead from Adorno's work concerning negative dialectics, which refuted Hegel's idea of dialectics that at some point in the future all the contradictions of life will be resolved through rational thought. Hegel therefore presented a positive approach towards dialectics. Watson had been invited to meet Zappa at his home in Laurel Canyon after Zappa had been diagnosed with prostate cancer to discuss Watson's book about him. The cartoonist Matt Groening, yes, he of The Simpsons fame, was also there, who poured scorn over Watson's work, who, according to Watson, called it demented scholarship. But the fact that such a book was written tells us about the complex character that was Frank Zappa. In Watson's piece in The Wire, he says this: one way of looking at Zappa's work is as a prolonged meditation on freedom. In 1968, We're Only in It for the Money mocked the hippies by suggesting that they read Franz Kafka's shocking tale In the Penal Colony and meditate on the concentration camps originally used for interning Japanese Americans during World War II that were being prepared by the Californian authorities for civil rights and anti-war activists. The decline of the American left and the eventual victory of Reaganism a decade later made such measures unnecessary, but Zappa's political vision, especially with the current growth of the far right in Europe, is still capable of chilling the blood. And here's a quote Watson uses from Zappa. The illusion of freedom will continue as long as it's profitable to continue the illusion. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery. They will pull back the curtains. They will move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you will see the brick wall at the back of the theatre. And Watson ended by saying, Frank Zappa, a modern composer who looked hard at social facts, a rare phenomenon. In the next episode, I'll be exploring Hannah Arendt's concept, the banality of evil, in relation to Israel. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.